Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm really pleased to welcome you to this BIUK webinar on systematic reviews. Systematic reviews have now been considered the gold standard for evidence-informed decision-making. Today, we will explore how evidence synthesis is changing and how it needs to change further to meet modern challenges. We have two speakers today, Dr. Leslie Atlee and Professor Andrew Booth. I will be chairing the session. I will just quickly introduce myself and then let Leslie and Andrew introduce themselves. My name is Hui Zhang, and I'm a BIUK Research Associate at the University of Sheffield. I've contributed to several multidisciplinary projects on sustainability, digital change, and behavioral research using systematic reviews and mixed methods approach. Leslie, would you like to go next, please?
I will. My name is Leslie Oatley. I'm a Senior Research Fellow in the School of Medicine and Population Health at the University of Sheffield, and I also work in BRUK in the methods work package, and I'm in the field of evidence synthesis and meta-research integrity. And over to you, Andrew.
Hey, thank you. Well, hello, everyone. My name's Andrew Booth. I'm Professor in Evidence Synthesis here at the University of Sheffield. I've been involved in systematic reviews since 1994. I currently co-direct a couple of evidence synthesis centres for the National Institute for Health Research, and I'm a co-convener of the Cochrane Qualitative and Implementation Methods Group. Back to our chair.
Thanks, Leslie and Andrew. So before we start the presentation, just a few housekeeping points. Today's webinar is about 90 minutes, so we will finish at 1:30. The use of AI note takers is not permitted during this webinar. The recording and materials will be shared after the event. Chat, audio, and video functions are disabled. If you have questions, please submit them via the Q&A box in your Zoom toolbar. So normally it's at the bottom of the Zoom. When submitting, let us know who your question is for, and also feel free to upvote any questions you'd particularly like to see answered. Also, just be aware that all questions submitted in the Q&A will be visible to everyone in this session. If you require closed captions and cannot see them, please click the CC button in your Zoom toolbar, normally at the bottom of the Zoom. If you'd like to follow up after the session, you can find contact details for BIUK members on our website or contact us at this email address. I think it's a really key thing to say upfront is systematic review method is actually a huge field, and we couldn't possibly cover everything in 90 minutes. Instead, our speakers, Leslie and Andrew, will share their expertise and perspectives on three key things. Theme one is about how evidence synthesis methods have developed over time. Theme two focuses on AI, automation, and research integrity. Leslie and Andrew will reflect on the rapidly changing evidence ecosystem, including the use of automation and AI tools to support and accelerate review processes. Theme three is about the opportunities and risks of modern evidence synthesis. Each theme presentation will run for about 15 minutes. After the presentation, we will open the floor to the audience questions. So please submit your questions via the Q&A box. We will start with the theme one presentation, and I will hand over to Leslie.
Thank you, Hui. Next slide, please. So yes, I will begin with where I started in evidence synthesis, which is about 15 years ago. So compared to Andrew, I'm a relative newbie in this field. But on the left is how I try to explain to master's students what a systematic review is to people who have maybe never heard of the topic. And I always introduce it as a type of literature review, which may or may not include a meta-analysis, and is a type of evidence synthesis that is regarded as the gold standard in the evidence-based hierarchy, and it is seen as a truly comprehensive, rigorous, and objective method of summarizing the literature. So this is the overview of a systematic review for a typical systematic review topic, which might be looking at the efficacy of a health intervention. So they work particularly well for that. But just flick to how it's going now in the next slide. And there is research showing from an initiative called the Evidence Synthesis Taxonomy Initiative, and it is run in the University of Adelaide, showing that there is a huge multiplicity of language used in evidence synthesis, and the field has completely exploded. So there are many different terms. There are many terms that may be referring to the same thing, but there are always evolving terminologies, which really goes to show how evidence synthesis has become a science in itself. And, just going back to thinking about systematic review as we know it for interventions, that fits well with those specific intervention topics. But in reality, it's very rare that as a reviewer that you get to do a traditional systematic review where it would be drug A compared to drug B. Actually, commissioners usually want to know, how does this drug A compare with everything else that's available, including standard of care? And so very often you have to tailor the review question. And I think the multiplicity of terms probably reflects the fact that it's very rare that you have a very simple review question that can be completely focused, and that people usually want to know as much as they can in a typical evidence synthesis. And so the pressure is on to kind of tailor it to be appropriate for the review question. Okay, but if we just look at the most common evidence synthesis that's there, systematic reviews, and flick to the next slide. So my work, I've been lucky enough to be funded by the Medical Research Council to lead a meta-research integrity initiative, looking at how published systematic reviews are appraised in the literature. And I do this with it's kind of a twofold living review. I publish a paper on the topic in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology, and it's now on a second version. The third version is just under peer review. And there's also a corresponding website which hosts all the data openly as well. And next slide, please. This work shows that there are currently 68 problems with published systematic reviews that are well documented across the literature. And this tree map shows generally the problems that are most frequently found. So those that appear largest are the most commonly found problems. That's not to say that they are actually the most important or severe problems. These are just the ones that are well studied. So really what is interesting to reflect on is that even using the most common evidence synthesis and the gold standard, they're still not often as impeccable in terms of their conduct as we might hope to. So there is work showing that secondary research is outpacing primary research in most fields. So evidence syntheses are a very common type of publication now. And what my work also finds is that often meta research can suffer from the same problems from which it's actually criticising systematic reviews for. So very often it's not conducted as impeccably as we might hope for. So going back to what I would tell my students in the next slide is that, yes, doing a systematic review, it does take a village and it is a big undertaking. But when it comes to any evidence synthesis, there are general principles that you can adhere to that will help your research and your review question adhere to principles of integrity. And that is to include as much evidence as is relevant and appropriate, to document transparently how you've conducted the research, to use best practice methods, and to state how you're going to do it before you start to do it by way of a protocol, and to think carefully about what you bring to the review question and making sure that you can deliver an impartial answer to that question and involve people so that you can get a meaningful answer to that question, but also manage any competing interests that your co-authors have. And I think that's about it for me on this topic, and I will pass over to Andrew for his perspective.
Thank you. So just a reminder, we're giving a personal perspective of the evidence synthesis landscape, how we got to where we are. Next slide, please. So it's been very exciting to be involved in the development of scientific reviews. Even though I've been around a long time, I don't go back to the ancient and 19th century column, but I was privileged enough to get involved in systematic reviews around about 1994, which was a notable time because the Cochrane collaboration had just had its inaugural meeting in the previous year, and it was about this time that the then NHS research strategy set up the Centre for Reviews and Dissemination in York, which offered a sort of blueprint for how institutions could get involved in systematic reviews. But where we are today is at the beginning of a new era. We're starting to see the increasing influence of large language models as we try and maximize both the value of the materials that we can mine in this systematic way, but also to make the process more speedily. And just near enough on the horizon to be a topic for us to consider today is the development of autonomous approaches to review, where essentially after specifying up front what you will be investigating, then you hand control over to an AI agent, and then your next involvement is in assessing the results. And the attraction of these particular methods are that this can be done in real time. And so it's not unusual for the early prototypes of these models to claim to deliver a review within a 10-minute period. So as I mentioned, I've seen some great changes. I'd like to highlight the nature of three of those. One of those is that although the systematic review model has remained relatively static, the Cochrane review, for example, as an overall framework, there has been tremendous methodological development underneath that framework. So developments in searching, developments in assessing the quality, developments in grading the certainty of recommendations. The second thing is departing from the systematic reviews of effectiveness, we see much more recognition of other types of systematic reviews, other types of evidence. So my own particular interests lie in qualitative evidence synthesis, currently part of a group developing a reporting standard, Prisma QES, which will look at making sure that that's done systematically. And I'm also involved in a standard for reporting systematic reviews of economic evaluations. So just two of the different variants that we're starting to see. And then there are methods that are quasi-systematic in that they have a system, but they don't follow the systematic review blueprint. So, for example, much of my work at the moment is around something called realist reviews. But as I say, they sort of stand with 1 foot in and 1 foot out of the systematic review camp. The other thing that Leslie remarked on was the development of types. We catalogued 14 review types in a seminal article, Grant and Booth. That was expanded recently to 50 types. And as Leslie says, if you go beyond the methodologies to just the labels, there are over 1,000 labels available. And just very briefly to cover some of the main changes, we've seen recognition that the protocol, rather than being absolutely fixed at the beginning, can be iterative and developed as one's knowledge increases. We've seen a movement away from an insistence on double reviewers to other models, such as, for example, looking at a sample of records as a second reviewer, or indeed identifying where the risk to the review lies and trying to minimize that and concentrate our checking on that bit. And although there's still a strong expectation, as Leslie highlighted, for comprehensive reviews within the field of qualitative evidence synthesis, where we're being interpretive, we're far more seeing the play of purposive sampling. It's just worth mentioning finally that this remains a high-income country activity, with much of the research being generated in high-income countries, most of the reviews being generated in those countries, and most of the review expertise lying in those geographical areas as well. Next slide, please. And so what I've just put together is a very brief sort of gallery, if you like, of some of the tensions that we see at the moment. The fact that, notwithstanding the number of labels we have, people often misuse labels. And so, for example, we see people using rapid review as an excuse for doing a bad review. We see also people confusing a scoping review with a mapping review. We also see people claiming that a systematic review is a scoping review so that they can justify not doing quality assessment. So much misuse of labels, and Alice wouldn't be pleased. Secondly, coincidentally, the Cochrane collaboration has the same initial letters as Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola started with an original brand like the Cochrane Review, but is now available in all of these variants. They too share their preoccupation with labels. I believe that they're turning Lilt into Lemon Fanta now. And so we see a lot of marketing going on, championing the brands of particular types of review, and reviewers making their careers on the back of very specific types. And then it's worth considering finally, is our purpose to get the reviews just in case, so populating the landscape of all research questions, or do the reviews keep their emphasis on supporting decision making, the so-called just-in-time model? And I'd just like to conclude this opening part by saying that we did a qualitative synthesis on medically unexplained symptoms, where it was clear that if patients got a label for what they were experiencing, that was positive because it could clarify expectations with their general practitioner. And we would argue that clarity around labels, not just the terms, but what is beneath the label, the substance there, is really important when we as reviewers are trying to communicate to our peer reviewers, to editors of journals, and to the commissioners of reviews. So thank you for your attention. I'll hand back to Hui.
Thanks both. That was a really insightful overview on how evidence synthesis is evolving. We already have some questions in the Q&A box, but I will pick up that during the Q&A session after the presentation. Before we start the next theme, I have one question and would like to hear your perspective on the question, if you don't mind. So is there a risk that increasing methodological diversity creates confusion for decision makers?
Shall I go first?
Please do.
I would say the short answer, yes. So, but this is where you, as the evidence synthesizer, can kind of step into that role, I suppose. And this is where your value is and why you are irreplaceable, is you're there to design the methods to be exactly appropriate to the review question and to justify the approaches that you're using. And that includes explaining the limitations of the approach that you're using. But I would direct people definitely to the right review tool approach that's come out of the evidence synthesis taxonomy initiative, because they've done a lot of their heavy lifting in really categorizing all these multiple review types, and that can really help you to decide which approach would be best. So that would be my answer.
I would support Leslie in what she says. As a co-director of one of the evidence synthesis centres funded by the NIHR, we find that initial meeting where you meet with the commissioners and discuss not just the review methodology, but the questions that are wanting to be answered, the constraints, whether they be time or otherwise, that is really important. And in fact, when we were running one of those early versions of that, we produced a lessons learned report for NIHR on that important, if you like, sensitization for both parties process, where we gain an understanding of the topic and the question, and then we can advise them on the types of review best to answer given the question and the types of evidence out there.
Thanks both for addressing that with such clarity. Shall we move on to our next thing? Andrew will start his presentation first, focusing on AI automation and research integrity.
Next slide, please. And on, yeah. So I've tried to summarize my concerns and observations into, again, a gallery of 3 pictures here. It's ironic, isn't it, that we've spent so much time and trouble as a group of researchers trying to make sure that the systematic review isn't a black box, that we can describe how each stage of the process takes place, that we've got reproducible methods that allow that to be validated, and we go for transparent reporting. And yet what we're seeing with AI is that we are creating another black box where we have little understanding about what is going on in the process. And so to me, there's again another tension between the transparency required to do a systematic review. It's not just judged by the output at the end of it. It's very much invests a lot of time and effort into quality during the process. And so are we prepared to hand that time and effort over to something that just because it can do it quicker? I've used the analogy of the sorcerer's apprentice. Of course, the apprentice only got into trouble when the sorcerer was away, and so there wasn't any supervision or checking of the process, and that's something that, as I'm currently involved in developing guidance with the evidence synthesis groups and for the Cochrane qualitative group, the occurrence of the importance of the human in the loop is virtually on every page. And just interesting and perhaps provocative observation here. Had a discourse with an editor of a journal last week, and they were saying that they'd been reading a paper where the people who did the review said that they had the human in the loop and that they had checked the AI contribution. And I had to draw to his attention the difference between just checking the output of the AI So in other words, seeing whether the AI has come up with plausible looking answers compared with checking the source articles that had been subject to AI to see if important information had been left on the cutting room floor. So you can see from that example that even just talking about human in the loop has two very important distinctions. And that's why I've put this quote at the bottom here, that the biggest threat from AI is its plausibility. It produces things that look right, and it particularly so now that some of these agents actually produce it in the form of what looks like a completed, finished journal article, again contributing to that cosmetic process. And you actually have to be quite perceptive to spot what we might call deep errors in systematic reviews, as opposed to spotting the sort of novice level errors. And so what AI may be doing is placing a premium on the expertise of the humans in the loop to scratch beneath the surface and actually reveal where the process is flawed. To a certain extent, the peer review process has helped protect us against the amateur reviewer, but will it similarly protect us against the AI-generated review? And so there's a real big issue here about remaining in control of the science. The apprentice could see the work advantages that were going to be present by having broomsticks do all the carrying for them. But as I say, the reviewer needs to be very proficient in being able to spot those deep errors. As an information specialist by origin, I recall the time we came up with the label satisfied but inept. Someone who could do a Medline search would be very pleased with it, but actually the search was rubbish. And I'm worried that that will be the case for systematic reviews. Next slide, please. If you're interested in seeing these plausible but systems that we need to be extremely critical and evaluative of, I've just put together 4 of these that I've been involved in evaluating. They undoubtedly do offer complementary perspectives and have features that alongside a review can be useful. But just to conclude my presentation with a word of caution, dig beneath the surface, see what that reveals. And a very quick example, just off the top of my head, literally, having had eggs for breakfast, I decided, is there a possible link between eating of eggs and hair loss? And sure enough, these AI tools produced very plausible looking outputs on that. But rather than observing the principles of study rigor, they basically surfaced to as low as they could get in order to support the hypothesis that I was advancing there. And so again, this is this danger of having a very plausible answer, but an answer that disregards our understanding of the difference between a biological assessment of effect against a randomized controlled trial within a rigorous context. So I'm going to conclude there and hand over to Leslie to handle the same question.
Thank you, Andrew. And I think my perspective very much builds upon Andrew's. So I have been lucky enough to undertake some very interesting work for UK CORI to have a look at what guidance was available. And this is for research generally in the UK. And so they wanted me to look at what policy and guidance was available specifically for researchers in UK higher education institutions. And they wanted me to look in a very fair way so that it wasn't just STEM heavy. So as well as the 24 Russell Group universities, I also looked at a sample of other universities that were more arts and humanities focused, and I had a sample that represented all 4 UK nations. And I also looked at funders and research societies and other organizations to produce research or advise on research, to see what guidance they had available. So that is available for you to look at on the UK CORI website. The main findings was that most universities at the time of September 2025 only had guidance for education and assessment. Just over a quarter had some specific guidance for researchers. And in delving into this topic, it helped me to gain a proper understanding of the many benefits and caveats to AI. So next slide, please. I came at it with the lens of research integrity and the threats. And this picks up on Andrew's point. So the threats to objectivity and why AI can probably be so harmful to us as researchers is because it's very flattering and it's built to kind of reward you and reinforce you for asking it a question, and it will try to find an answer basically that makes sure that you are always right. And it is very addictive to be told that you've asked a great question. And instead of just performing a simple Google search or, for example, using a calculator, it can be actually more rewarding to use AI. But AI has a higher environmental cost, and there are that there is resource use that you don't see because it happens so seamlessly in front of your eyes. And it's very sycophantic and tells you that you're right, and it can be overconfident. It doesn't tell you, here's your answer, but here's all the problems with your answer, and this is what a systematic reviewer can do. It will tell you it with quite a high degree of certainty. So that is problematic. Next slide. So problems with transparency is really, we might think that we're getting quite an up-to-date answer, but actually most AI models have a data cutoff. And so it's only drawing upon data that it's programmed to access. And also it has randomness built in so that you never get the same answer twice. So this is the stochastic nature of it. So this has implications for reproducibility and being able to verify how you obtained the answer. And then we really are unsure, unless you query the AI model that you're using, how it drew upon those data sources and whether it might be violating any data protection. And so this is why you see the term hallucination so often, because based on these limitations, it can produce answers that appear plausible but may just be false. And that is the problem with transparency of AI. And then when it comes to rigor, next slide, please. So when we do a traditional systematic review, we try to be as comprehensive as possible, whereas AI is largely drawing upon easily, readily accessible data, which is available on the internet, and it won't have access to research that's behind a paywall, non-English research, domain-specific expertise, and marginalized voices. And what you are getting when you sample AI is really the most readily available literature. And then when we produce an output with AI, we put that back into the internet. And again, it is drawing upon the same research that it's producing, and it's creating a monoculture of knowing. So it just doesn't meet the standards that people expect of an evidence synthesis that is conducted to a high standard. Next slide, please. And then in terms of inclusivity, which I believe is an important consideration when it comes to research integrity, there is just not exactly a level playing field in terms of how AI models have been developed, the data that they're using, and also who has access to those tools, and how it will affect those that can use it in order to get ahead. And there are downsides to it in terms of what do we lose when we outsource our cognitive thinking to AI, and how we may atrophy those skills that we have learnt to this point in order to be able to do the jobs that we're doing. So there are quite a few caveats. I have to say, I am an avid user of AI, but I tend to use it for the things that would save me time. But when it comes to the most creative and interesting parts, and that is understanding the limitations of my work and really trying to think about the applicability of findings, I would prefer to retain the skills there. And I'm trying to be more selective about how I use AI rather than outsource my thinking to it every time. So that's my perspective on AI in terms of research integrity.
Thanks, Leslie and Andrew, for sharing your perspectives and experience on the changing evidence ecosystems, including AI automation and research integrity. As a systematic review researcher myself, I'm still navigating the AI field, and I'd like to follow up with a question. In the debate of human versus automation, what is the optimal mix? Where should automation stop and human oversight begin?
I'll kick off this time, Leslie. That's a very good question, Faye. As we sort of mentioned earlier, every stage of the systematic review process has been sort of created for that human insight. So things that if it's not our own particular area of expertise, we might be tempted to use AI in those areas, and that actually is the worst thing that you can possibly do. So to just give an instance, the search strategy. So a lot of people, researchers, can do, notwithstanding my comments earlier, can do a fit for purpose search, but of course it's taken to new levels when you're doing that within the context of a systematic review. And so it would be very tempting for a researcher to hand over the development of a search strategy to AI. But interestingly, the guidance that has been produced by Cochrane for rapid reviews and also for AI responsible use as well, both of them insist on the importance of the librarian in that particular approach, the information specialist. So paradoxically, we've got a situation where if we're going to use AI, we perhaps should be using it for the areas that we know best rather than the areas that we're least comfortable with, because then we can use our human in the loop responsibly and meaningfully. So it's not just about token involvement, and hopefully my answers earlier on giving those examples show that it's very easy to show that humans were involved, but the real important thing isn't the quantity, but it's the quality of that human input.
Thanks, Andrew. So yeah, I would build upon that and say, when it came to looking at this guidance across the UK context, there was a general consensus around the fact that you cannot have AI authors, and that the human is always the ultimate guarantor of any work. And so I would say that yes, human in the loop, but that is really a baseline. And you really want the human should verify every single word of that report, and they should be able to stand behind it. It's not going to be acceptable to say, oh, that was introduced when we ran it through AI. And also there's research to show that if you generate an answer with AI, you don't really read it and absorb it. And so you may be publishing these things, but they're not your original thoughts. So you struggle to stand behind it when you're asked about it. The thing that there was less consensus about was how transparent you should be about the use of AI. Yes, you should be honest about how you've used it, but do you need to be transparent about every prompt that you use and every output that you've used as well? That there is definitely a lack of consensus on just how transparent we should be. And are we transparent about every single model of AI we've used, and are we aware of the various caveats and data sources that each model draws upon? So I think I've answered the question with more questions. So sorry about that.
That's all right. It's very thanks for answering the question. I also agree it's about the quality than the quantity. Also, it's be transparent about the AI. And I asked my manager in a meeting before, like, if I use AI in my research, am I responsible for the AI outputs? And I quite like how my manager answered the question. Of course, because AI would be your research student on the project, and you are responsible for managing the project and the outputs from the project. I guess, yeah. We will have more questions on this theme in the second part of our webinar. Now let's move on to our final theme. Leslie will start us off our presentation on the opportunities and risks of modern evidence synthesis.
Okay, thank you very much, Hui. Next slide, please. So we're in an epidemic. We're in a time where information is abundant, but attention is not. And so I think one of the opportunities that I like to seize upon is how to produce outputs that really can summarize your research succinctly. And one of those approaches would be to produce an infographic or a visual representation. Graphical abstracts are used as journal papers as a way to kind of summarize your findings quickly to the readers, because we can't take for granted these days that everybody is going to read our papers in full and absorb all the findings from start to finish. And so whilst we want to be very careful that we don't introduce any spin in those summaries, we want to think of creative ways to be able to present our findings in a palatable way that helps our research to have a legacy and to be used and built upon by others. And so this is something that I have tried to do in the next slide when it came to the previous projects that I have just presented in terms of AI, but also in terms of the research culture review that I did. And it's very helpful when you're doing a big picture review where you have a lot of different findings and you want to be able to present them in a way that makes sense. And you don't want to produce just a great big table or to have vast swathes of text. And so I have used a process which is content analysis to basically find the gist of the papers and understand the main message, ascribing keywords. And then I've used a combination of different approaches that I've heard about: storyboard synthesis and conceptual metaphor theory, to try to draw the findings together. And personally, I like to use an analogy or a phrase to give those concepts a little bit more meaning. So next slide, please. And the way that I did this with the research culture project is to come up with some slightly provocative labeled analogies to really tease apart how these different issues are interacting and how we can understand the bigger picture of what's going on. And so this is just a method that I have tried to really add some depth of understanding and help people to engage in a very complicated topic, because I think in evidence synthesis, you're in a position of privilege that you have an overview, and it's really important to be able to try to summarize it in a way that is going to resonate with people. So I won't go into each of the diagrams in detail, but we'll just take a look at the wheel of fortune of questionable research practices in the next slide. And it's not my aim to try to teach you all the questionable research practices, but really what I did here was I took the scientific cycle. So we hypothesize, you design the study, you conduct the study, analyze it, interpret, publish, and this is a well-known cycle. And I used that as the basis of the analogy, and then I had to come up with, well, what can it be? It's a wheel. And I tried to accurately categorize every single questionable research practice in terms of where they happen at this stage. Wheel of Fortune may not be the most appropriate analogy, but it's just a way to kind of make it more fun, more interesting. And I suppose that is maybe a rarer part of being evidence synthesis. It can have its boring bits, and so any opportunities to insert yourself in there and bring something new, I would encourage people to try it. Another approach that you can use to thinking about different review questions is mind mapping. Next slide, please. So this is an approach that we've taken in BR UK for a recent review that we've been doing for the UK Government for Science, Go Science, to understand misinformation or disinformation. And it's it's an online software, and it helps you to generate mind maps for very complex, big picture reviews where you're trying to semantically summarize a topic to somebody in the field. And so that's another technique that I would advocate for. So I think I've probably concentrated mainly on the opportunities and less so on the risks. But that's my summary. Over to you, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. I just remark on, in the context of Leslie's presentation and what we said earlier, how useful AI is for developing the graphical versions of some of these metaphors, particularly for people like myself who have 10 thumbs and are not artistically gifted. But even in that context, I did find myself accepting a spelling mistake in a complex graphic that was produced by AI because I had little confidence that if I asked it to do the same again, it would come up with as good a representation. So it's an instance there of allowing a minor error through in the interests of presenting, and that raises all sorts of issues, doesn't it? Where you've set your own threshold for reporting things accurately, and you're allowing something to pass in the interests of graphical presentation. But focusing more on what I plan to bring out here, I've rather provocatively called this giving the customer what we or they think they want. And it's just a reminder to us all that reviewers don't own the systematic review methodology. It's co-owned by the customers or the commissioners, and also I'm often reminded by patients and the public. It's with public money, and so if we invent 1,000 labels, if we make each review unique in itself to answer a specific question. And if we veil that in complex discussions of methodology, are we really improving the science, or are we taking backward steps? And Leslie's quite rightly focused on the importance of presenting the outputs in an understandable way. As a methodologist, I'm also concerned about this trade-off between standardization, so knowing what you're getting, and innovation. Over the course of the 30 years I've been involved in systematic reviews, I've come up with some new methods, and it's often difficult to get people, peer reviewers, to accept new methods. And that's because they will often judge them by inappropriate standards, standards of proof or evaluation, or by applying standards from one area to another. And rather frustratingly, I see this in peer review that, for example, I might be doing some work on realist synthesis, or I might be doing a scoping review, and might introduce an innovative area to find that the peer reviewer has repeated or reported back to me what the general expectation is, and expecting me to conform to that. So when someone is making their observations, for example, on a scoping review, from their knowledge of one key source, it's rather frustrating for me as a methodologist, with our article mentioned earlier on review types having received over 15,500 citations, to be told that you're doing it wrong. And so I think that's an argument for greater clarity, but it's also an argument for the fact that review techniques are a specialist area, and that we have to have a way of getting a balance between innovation and trustfulness. And trustfulness isn't doing everything by the manual. Think what art or mechanics would look like if everything had been done by a manual. But it is important to keep asking ourselves, are we producing what decision makers can actually use? Leslie quite rightly focused on the presentation of this, but it's been said that this is the sort of the last mile out of the 100-mile journey, that we've got much of this systematic review methodology sorted out, but we're still learning about how best to get findings across to people and into practice. And that's really where our efforts should be concentrated, not so much on a plethora of labels. I've sort of mentioned here, if we're not careful, we'll start writing more and more about less and less, until finally we're writing everything about nothing. Leslie's already documented the fact that reviews, because they are relatively easy with compared to data collection extending over a year, absolutely swamping the scientific literature field. And this was particularly a problem during COVID, when people couldn't do the original data collection. And experts like Paul Glaziou and Ian Chalmers have estimated that 50% of reviews don't get published, and then 50% of those will have errors. And so you progressively get down to a very small number of reviews that make a difference. And I think we're all drawn into our chosen disciplines by the desire to make a difference. And so anything we can do to preserve that is important. And without getting sort of cultural about it, there are certain societies that give incentives for producing dramatic findings. And within reviews, John Ioannidis has highlighted how many reviews are being produced on essentially so that they're writing everything about nothing, that they are surrendering that ability to make a difference in the interest of doing something that is possible. And so next slide, please. So the question isn't what evidence synthesis can do, but what it should do. And the ethical concerns and integrity concerns that Leslie are highlighting are, to a greater extent, much more important for the development of the science than the technical progress being made by AI. Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie and Andrew, for the presentation on the opportunity and risks of modern evidence synthesis. I have one last question from me. What does fit for purpose mean in 2026 evidence synthesis context?
I suppose I'll go first. I think fit for purpose means understanding exactly what your commissioner needs, or whoever has designed the research question. And yes, one size does not fit all, but designing an approach that is clear about the methodological approach and what the limitations are, avoiding scope creep, where decision makers probably would like to have more evidence, but you as the researcher have to remain aware of your academic integrity and what it is appropriate to synthesize and be able to comment on within the timescales and the resources that you've been given, and just remaining firm about what can be accomplished and what would require further funding and further research in order to be able to give more definitive answers on. Andrew?
Thank you. Yeah, I see an analogy, so Leslie will like the fact I'm using analogies. I can see an analogy in the plugs and sockets world of electrical appliances, and that we have to use the adapter, if you like, for the particular country that we're in, so that the standardization across the whole methodology isn't a valid aspiration, but recognizing the difference and using the different plugs and sockets appropriately becomes the key issue. Of course, that also means that we have to be able to communicate risk, because you can't go sticking any plug into any socket around the world. So I think a responsible, fit-for-purpose review will make the decision maker, whether they're a member of the public or a commissioner, will make them aware not only of what it has done, but also what it hasn't done and can't do. So to that extent, is still being risk averse rather than trying to do as AI does, which is trying to encourage action regardless of how good the evidence is.
Thanks both for answering that questions. I'm going to stop the presentation because we are now open the floor for questions from the audience, if that's okay. I've got quite a few questions. Shall we take one by one? So the first question would be, there are now too many systematic reviews because arguably there are too many primary evidence studies. So then is the need for reviews. But should we try to moderate the number of reviews? If so, what is the mechanisms?
Well, as long as they're not my review, I'm quite in favour of it. No, sorry. I mean, I guess the important point here is twofold. That we should always start by reviewing the literature before we start our review. So, in other words, we must make sure that there isn't already a review. And then we should think very carefully about what the added value is of our planned review over any existing reviews. So that caution would eliminate us replicating research waste or is contributing to research waste. The second thing is, once they have been produced, is moving the really flawed peer review process, really upping the ante, improving the review process, because peer reviews can often be sent to someone who's been plucked off the internet, who has very little credentials, and who gets away with a very bare minimum in feeding back. And so if we are going to only publish the best reviews, then we need to have a better peer review system, that's fit for purpose. That doesn't mean to say that the process of collecting together studies should always be predicated on a review. So living reviews offers a possible answer, so that we're making sure that we're engaging with the new evidence. We're not just throwing out the new evidence with a bad review, or a review that didn't make it clear the need for it. So I think a combination of those three things would certainly help in sort of winnowing down the multitude of reviews that we're seeing at the moment. Leslie.
Yeah, I would just say, in terms of, do we need different review types? Yes, we do, but we need to check if an existing approach is appropriate. And then, do we need to publish every single review that we do? Not necessarily. No, sometimes, if it's just for the purposes to inform something else, we don't need to. And we do need to address the incentives that are in researcher assessment, and the fact that we are rewarded for the volume of publications, because that incentive drives us to try to publish evidence syntheses which maybe don't need to be published. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks for answering the questions. I think it's not just about doing a systematic review, it's translating the systematic review outputs to different audience. So, for example, how can you tell policymakers about the effect size, small, medium, big? What does this mean to me? So translating a language that matters to them is quite important as well. Let's move on to the next question. So one audience asked the justification for doing a scoping systematic review is changing. So considering the other questions stating that there might be too many reviews, is it correct? Or is it, if so, how would we assess whether a review is justified or not?
Personally, I think we can do a little bit more work in really horizon scanning for what reviews already exist in the area, and whether a new review genuinely adds anything new. And this involves not just looking in your traditional databases, but looking at work that's ongoing and registered as well, in terms of maybe Open Science Framework and other repositories where protocols are registered. And that might be the best way to work out whether a review is justified. Andrew?
Yeah, so what has changed is that funding boards frequently require you to demonstrate a good knowledge of the literature that you're going to be planning to review. So researchers are quite obviously anxious that they're being asked to do an element of reviewing up front before they get any money for it as part of the proposal. I mean, methodologically and scientifically, that is a good approach, but I don't think funders recognize fully exactly how much that can involve, and so I think it would be good, if you like, where the model of funding was that you were given, if you like, seed pearl funding to actually investigate the need for a review, and then you could assign some proper time to it. But certainly, yeah, funders are expecting you to have an idea of the quantity and quality of the information you're going to review before you actually get the money for doing a review. So it's a very difficult situation.
Thanks, both. We have another question in terms of the different labels have been used for review. So these different labels can cause delay and challenge with the early stage of the review. So the audience is quite interested in any hints and tips for approaches that can minimize this problem.
Sorry, yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
No, go after you, Leslie.
I was just going to say, I am nothing without a very experienced information specialist, and I rely heavily on them in the early phases of a review to help me to populate a list of the multiplicity of terms and to really think carefully about what are the different things that we're possibly looking at here, and how might this have been catalogued in across the literature in different ways. So I can't do a systematic review without a well-trained librarian, information resource support person who understands how to look carefully at the various synonyms for terminology.
Yeah, I had a slightly different perspective on the question, and either of our interpretations might be right. But I was wondering if it was in specific relation to the review labels, and I'm fighting a bit of what I recognise as a losing battle in that people get to use them, and therefore they become adopted out of frequency of use rather than very strict definitions. So as I say, I'm fighting a losing fight. So I'm very clear with my students, at least, because I can still influence them, that there's a difference between a scoping and a mapping review. And a scoping, as its name suggests, is preliminary to some other plan of research, whether that be primary research or secondary research, whereas mapping is much more being able to chart the characteristics of a field. Now, you see those terms used interchangeably. I also mentioned the fact that people sort of conflate scoping reviews, meaning something that they've done not quite as well as the systematic review, and the systematic review itself. So yeah, the other one, which is a bit more pedantic, is I distinguish between an umbrella review and an overview. And an umbrella review is, for me, like an umbrella having even spokes, is where an organization such as Cochrane or the JBI or something equivalent in your various fields has produced a number of reviews. And so they are like spokes, but they're being done to sort of a common approach, common methodology covering a field. Whereas an overview is more fortuitous, taking advantage of what reviews are out there and trying to look for patterns in them, make sense of them. But as I said, this is a losing fight, and no matter how much I insist on them, I'm being outvoted every day by hundreds of people who publish with labels that are the opposite of what I want them to do.
Thanks, both. I guess in terms of labels, they're primary guidelines for different types of reviews. If you call yourself scoping reviews, then perhaps try the primary review process, and then that would give you the right to call that right name, I guess. Let's move on to Andrew. Did you say?
I was just going to say a very quick thing. The problem that we had was that the scoping reviews were defined a long time before the mapping reviews. And so in the absence of the mapping review definitions, everything was being called a scoping review. So that makes it even harder to separate them after the effect.
True. Okay, let's move on to the next one. It's about the transparency and reproducibility enough for a rapid review to be considered systematic.
Leslie?
Well, so yeah, I think Andrew mentioned this before. Rapid can be used as a kind of disclaimer for an abbreviation to all kinds of different methods that you would strive for in a systematic review. I think probably not. I think you still have to try to adhere to some forms of rigor, and you do still have to enforce some systematic processes. But yeah, transparency definitely helps, but it's not everything that you would need for a rapid review. Andrew?
So, yeah, a quick observation that both Lewis Hamilton and Noddy drive rapid cars, but you wouldn't want to race one against the other. So rapid is a misused label anyway. I welcome what the anonymous attendees said about, sort of the importance of transparency and reproducibility. But if you go back to last dictionary of epidemiology, which I suppose appropriately would have the last word, systematic reviews are reviews that have strategies to limit bias, and so transparency and reproducibility aren't necessarily trying to do that. And so I would at least require one extra thing there, which is that the methods that are transparently and reproducibly reported have been utilizing strategies to limit bias.
Thanks, Leslie, Andrew. How I address rapid review, I always think compared to systematic review, rapid review is I do the same process, but then maybe, for example, if I search the literature rather than search in last 10 days or 10 years, I search last 5 years or 3 years to make it more rapid.
Just a very quick comment back, Hui. There's a very useful distinction that I find helpful between an accelerated review and an abbreviated review. So you can pour the same resources into a shorter time period. That's the accelerated review, but you're not making any compromises on the quality. Abbreviated is where you're deliberately making shortcuts, and there it's really important to say what the implications of those shortcuts are. So even within the rapid reviews family, there are helpful, useful distinctions.
That's helpful. Thanks for the clarification. Next question, we're back on probably AI again. So if the emphasis is on research being in charge, should human in the loop become human in the lead?
I just want to put a smile emoji for that. I think it's a really nice comment, but I don't think it requires anything more than just acknowledging that, yes, the human, as Leslie illustrated, provides the added value to the review process. The review process in itself is fairly boring and mundane. So, yeah, humans should definitely be in the lead.
Thanks. And also, given all the issues with using AI for reviews, could you share your experience, probably how currently you are using AI in your review work?
I would say that personally, I wouldn't use it for anything in terms of relying on it to find evidence for me. The best way that I find of using it is in a sandbox mode, such as Notebook LM from Google Gemini, where you can ask it to look for something in a paper, and you know that it's only going to look at the paper. It's not going to draw in any unknown sources. Or you can add several papers and ask it to kind of summarize them just to get a gist or a feel for it. But again, I wouldn't rely on it solely. I still need to understand where it was said in that paper. So you do need to make a note of that. But that sandbox mode is really useful for being able to get a quick overview of a bunch of papers.
Yeah, I use AI a lot in the initial sensitization, scoping, planning of the review. I've used it for producing Gantt charts, for example, to help fit the task into a particular time frame, to calculate, the quantity of literature and to characterize the main types of literature. So very preliminary, almost outside of the review content itself. In terms of within the review, it's helpful for tabulation and summary, but only as a starting point. I mentioned that you can't believe that just because something is in a table, the AI has got everything that's relevant. This is particularly the case with qualitative reviews, where context or theory might be important and might not therefore be in the place that the AI expects to see it in an average article. And my general take-home message is to treat AI like a moody adolescent that will usually only do what you ask it to do reluctantly, that it will find any excuse to sort of bail out of the process as early as possible without necessarily completing the job, and will require frequent reminders in order to make sure that it goes through with what you're asking it.
Thanks, both. I guess AI tools is kind of can be used for different systematic review stage. So I've used AI tools for the screening stage, and I found it very helpful. So I've used Ryan and Confidence. So these AI tools can help you automatically highlight the duplications rather than I have to manually highlight them. But it needs like human input to resolve these duplications. It also have the kind of nice functions how multiple reviewers can screen the studies as well. So yeah, there are different AI tools for different stages of reviews, I guess. Yeah, Andrew.
Sorry, just a very quick comment on that. You're absolutely right. Where they work best is where they are built into an existing review function. But even there, they're being used cautiously, like a second reviewer or a starting point. But yes, those tend to be the better applications.
Yes. Move on to the next question. The audience is interested in the panel's views on living systematic reviews. So what pitfalls must be avoided to ensure they enhance rather than compromise the research integrity?
Well, I would say think very carefully before doing a living systematic review, because it is a hugely time-consuming undertaking and really only needs to be done where there is a vast amount of emerging evidence in the area, or you need to be able to understand how something is changing over time. So I, designed my methodological living review at the outset to be living, but you also need to understand when is it time for it to kind of go into sleep mode as well, because as soon as one update is complete, I'm pretty much on with the next one. In terms of I'm not sure if I understand what the threats are to integrity from a living review versus a non-living review. I'm not sure if that's different. Andrew, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, specifically on living reviews, I was involved a lot in thinking about something before them, review updates, and the considerations for those are very similar in terms of the prevalence of the literature, the urgency and relative importance of the question. But as Leslie said, the additional thing is the investment of time and resources. And if not the living review, what could you be doing as a new review that might make an equal or better contribution? So there's definitely an opportunity or sunk cost argument to be had there, and I see those reservations as more important than those relating to scientific integrity. It's not like Leslie, it's not an argument I've particularly seen rehearsed in the literature to date.
Thanks, both. We only have 2 minutes left. We still have some questions, but I don't know. If you really want speakers' perspectives on these questions, just email us, and we'd be happy to share our perspectives and experience on these points. I'd like to say thank you for everyone for this such engaging discussion, and thanks again to Leslie and Andrew for your valuable insights on how evidence synthesis is changing. Before we close, I'd like to mention our upcoming BR UK webinar So the host will put the link in. Oh, you can see the BRUK or the QR code on the screen to register. This session will introduce BRUK's statement on the effective and responsible use of AI in behavioral research. Thank you again for joining us today. We hope to see you at a future event.